it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be bringing you another all dies card using Lawn Fawn's Tree Branches Backdrop Landscape and the Magic Iris Beehive add-on. So I'm going to start by trimming out the Tree Branches Backdrop Landscape out of some chocolate bar cardstock. Just going to run that through my die cutting machine, and then I can pop that out, and I'm going to remove the inner pieces of this die cut. I am just gently releasing the negative portion around the branches, making sure that they don't get bent. And you may notice that I didn't line this up perfectly as I ran it through my die cutting machine, but that's okay. I'm going to be adding a frame to this later on, so it won't even be noticeable. Then I'm going to move on to my leaves, and I'm going to be die cutting both the small and large leaves out of some cilantro cardstock and some noble fir, so both sizes out of both colors. And I'll just pop those out into a little dish here. This is a Twiddler's Nook embellishment tray, and I'm going to set those aside for later on while I get the rest of my die cuts together. Then I'm going to take the Magic Iris Beehive add-on, and I'm going to die cut the beehive out of some sunflower cardstock. It's a nice golden yellow that I think will work well for this. And then I'm going to die cut the bees out of sticky note, black licorice, and also some pearlized vellum, which I will use for the wings. I'm going to cut the main part of the body out of the sticky note, the backer part of the body out of the black licorice, and then, like I said, the wings out of the pearlized vellum, which I think gives them a really nice kind of ethereal look. It makes them look transparent, since that vellum is see-through, and it also has a nice kind of iridescent shimmer to it that really makes it look like wings. So again, I'm just going to pop all of my pieces into my tray. I'm also going to die cut some flowers, and I'm going to do that out of some ballet slippers cardstock, and then I'll cut the centers of the flowers out of guava cardstock and pop those into my tray. Just continue adding all of my little bits and pieces until I have everything trimmed out. And then I also am going to die cut part of my sentiment. I'm going to use Finley's ABCs for that, and I will trim that out of some more guava cardstock, and I'm going to spell out the word bee. Now I want to add a bit of shading to all of my die cuts, and I'm going to do that with Copic markers today just because there's lots of little nooks and crannies, and I think I have a bit more control with some Copics rather than using like Distress Oxides and a blending brush. I can just get into all of these little areas with the tip of my marker. So for the tree branches, I am going to use E43, E44, and E47. I'm coming in with my E47 first, and I'm placing that on the underside of each of these branches. I'm not going to bother with the leaves because they're going to be completely covered up, but I will then come in with my midtone, which is going to be the E44, and I will just pull that darkest color up a little bit higher on those branches, creating that nice underside shadow and giving them some depth and dimension. You can also leave your die cuts plain if you want to, but I just decided to add a little bit of a punch to these by doing the coloring. So my final shade is going to be E43, which is going to end up looking very similar to the cardstock itself. So it's just going to help blend in the coloring with what I've done, especially once this ink does dry a bit. It looks a little bit dark on the colored cardstock right now, but it will be a little bit softer as that ink dries back. Then I'm going to move on to my leaves, and for the cilantro leaves, I'm going to add some YG01 and YG03, and I'm doing that on one side of each of the leaves, so I'll be coloring about half of the leaf in total, again just to give that a bit of dimension. I started with the YG03, and then I'm blending out with the YG01. And then for the darker noble fir leaves, I'm going to use G24 and G28. Just adding that line of G28 on one edge of those leaves. And then once I have those all done, I will come in with my second shade, which is going to be the G24, and I will bring that coloring right up about into the middle where that little line is die cut into each of these leaves. I'll add the finished leaves into another little dish, and then we'll move on to the beehive. I'll pop out the center because I'm not going to use that for today's project. And then the colors I'm going to use are Y13, Y15, Y17, and YR27. And I am going to add my shading on the right hand side. And so I am taking that YR27 and just adding a little bit of color. I'm also going to add it under the stitch detail on each of the little sections that make up the beehive, and then add a little bit of shading on the left side when it falls after the center hole. And then I'll blend out that YR27 with the Y17. Again, just making sure to go over that YR27, over the edge of that, and soften that darker color into this one of the midtones here. And I'm going to just color my way across from right to left using some nice little flicking motions. Once I have all of the Y17 laid in, I will switch to the Y15 and continue my way across. Again, going over the previous shade, so I'm using that Y15 to drag the Y17 out a little bit farther so that I get a nice smooth blend, and just work my way into the cardstock that is left. And then my final shade is going to be the Y13, which I will basically fill in the inner sections with. Like I said, this will dry back quite a bit, so it will be almost the same as the sticky note cardstock was originally once it's fully dry. Then I'm going to move on to my bees, and for those I'm going to go with a similar color palette, but I'm going to go a little bit lighter. I'm going to keep the Y15 and Y13 and add the Y11 to that. And again, I'm just going to do my shading on the right hand side. It's just a little bit easier for me being left-handed, but you could absolutely switch it to the other side if you prefer. And then I'm just going to work my way across using all three shades. Then I'm going to bring in T5 and T7, and I'm going to color their little antenna to be black. So I'm going to add the T7 closest to the head and go about halfway up those antenna. And then I will fill in the rest with that T5, just making sure to color the edges as well so I don't have any of that sticky note cardstock showing through on the sides. Then for the bodies of the bees, I wanted to try to add a little bit of shading to those as well. I don't know how well it worked, but I decided to just give it a try anyway. So I'm using the T7 for that and flicking that pretty heavily on the right hand side. I could see that it was drying back almost immediately on that dark cardstock, so I decided to bring in one shade darker with the T9 and add a bit of shading with that. And then I can add these little bits into my finished tray. I'll move on to my flowers. I'm going to just make sure I have all 6 of those on my little mat here. And then I need all 6 centers as well. So I'm just going through my tray, making sure I've got them all. And it turned out that one of them was missing. So I just went back to that little piece of cardstock that I had die cut them from, and one was still stuck in there. So I had all 6 that I needed. For the flowers, I'm going to shade with R20 and R22. I'm going to add that R22 closest to the center. I'm not bothering to fill in the center because it will be covered up by the little circle centers that I've die cut. but I'm just going to add that coming in on the base of each petal. And then I'll switch to the R20 and just flick that out a little bit farther, and I'll leave the plain ballet slippers cardstock showing through at the ends of each of the petals. So it'll give it a nice ombre look as that starts to fade. And you could definitely make this card without the floral elements if you wanted it to be a bit more of a masculine card, but I just wanted a nice pop of color in the mix, so that's why I decided to add them. For the centers of the flowers, I'm going to keep the R22 but add in the R24. I'll start with that and then just blend out with that R22, and I'll add those to my little dish as well. To fill in the whole of my beehive, I'm going to take another scrap of that chocolate bar cardstock, and I'm going to use the same brown shades that I used on my tree branches. I'm using that beehive as a guide to start my circle with that E47, and then I'll just widen that a little bit and make the circle a little bit larger, or the backward C shape a little bit larger. Then I'll bring in the E44 and start to blend that out toward the left-hand side, just making sure to add enough ink that everything looks nice and smooth. And then I will bring in the E43 to finish off that circle on the left-hand side and just fill everything in. The last little elements that I need to add some shading to are my die-cut letters, and I'm going to go back to the shades that I used on the centers of the flowers, which is the R22 and R24, and I am just kind of outlining the letters with that R24 so that they have a bit of a central glow in the middle and a little bit of a defined edge on the outer parts. These letters are going to end up right in the center of my card, so I really wanted them to be eye-catching, which is why I chose a vibrant color, and I wanted it to echo one of the colors that was not quite so prominent on the card, which is why I decided to go with the same shade as the centers of the flowers, since those are super tiny. I blended out the R24 with the R22, and then I just decided to smooth out the centers by going over it with the R20. It's such a light color that it will actually dry back to be just about the same shade as the guava cardstock, but it will just make the coloring a little bit more smooth. So now I need to work on my background. So I'm taking a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock, and I am going to use the cloudy stencil to add a sky background. I'm going to blend on some Salvaged Patina Distress Oxide ink. So I'm just starting at the top of that stencil, pressing a little bit firmly as I leave the stencil, and then lifting up on the pressure as I go up the panel. And then I'll just turn that stencil to get a different cloud formation and work my way across again. Now, this ink blending tool I have used for other blues in the past. I don't have a designated ink blending tool for all of my shades of Distress Oxide ink, so it didn't end up coming out quite as pure as the Salvaged Patina. It probably had like a little bit of Salty Ocean or something like that in it, so it's a little bit bluer than this shade would typically be just from what was left over on that ink blending foam. I'm going to do one more cloud formation. I ended up switching my stencil to the back side to get the cloud formation that I had on the top row just in reverse. And then I'll add that ink down at the bottom. And I did end up shifting my stencil just slightly so it didn't line up perfectly. So I'm just going to go over that again and fill in with a little bit more ink so it's less noticeable. And once I have my tree branches and all of my other elements over top, it really won't be noticeable at all. I'll add some more ink down to the bottom row just so it has the same kind of faded look as the rest of each of those clouds. And then I'm going to do some splatter detail to give it a bit more interest. So I'll press some of that Salvaged Patina Distress Oxide ink onto an acrylic block. I'll add a spritz of water to that to make it more fluid, mix it up with a thin paintbrush, and then just tap that all over the background till I get a nice fine spray of dots all over. And then once I'm happy with this, I will just set it aside to dry. Next, I'm going to work on the rest of my sentiment, and I'm going to pop the center of my beehive into my MISTI, treat that with my Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool, and then I'm going to stamp in Versamark ink, and I'm taking a tiny little sentiment from Let's Toast, and it says Happy Heart Day, but I actually trimmed out the heart so that I could split the word up. So I'm putting happy at the top and day at the bottom with enough space in between to add my die cut letters later on. Then I'm going to coat this with some white embossing powder. This is Lawn Fawn white embossing powder. Top off any excess from the back, and then I will heat my heat gun off to the side for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then bring that to both the front and back of that panel to eliminate as much warping as possible and melt that powder to a nice white shiny look. Then for the inside of my card, I'm going to stamp on another piece of Ballet Slippers cardstock with bubblegum ink, and I'm using the Hive 5 stamp set, and I did the beehive with a trail and another bee and a sentiment that says "You're sweet as honey." I'm going to stamp that down twice to make sure I have a nice bold impression. And now I'm ready to start assembling. So I've added some very thin little strips of foam tape to the back of my tree branches backdrop landscape. And I also added them behind the branches and leaves to make sure that everything was really well supported. And I'm going to pop that up over my cloudy background. Then I'm going to bring in my beehive, and I'm going to add the little back piece behind. I cleaned off the Rabbit Hole Designs powder with a microfiber cloth from Picket Fence, and now I'm just adding some glue to the corners, and then I can line up that beehive over top, making sure I have that sentiment on there straight how I want it. And then I can flip that over and also reinforce it with a little bit of paper tape to make sure that that stays in place. Once I have that secured, I am going to line that up on my card front, figure out where it's going and where I need to add some additional foam tape for support. So the easiest way to do that is kind of just pop the foam tape straight onto the card between those branches. And I just keep double checking to make sure that I'm not going to add any tape where it's going to end up being visible. Once I think I have enough tape to fully support that nice big beehive, I'll just pull off those release papers and pop that beehive right over top in the center. I added another piece up at the top to make sure that that part was well supported. I don't want to have any buckling if this card ends up going through the mail. Then I'll bring in my dish of leaves and bees and add some liquid glue to all of the smaller leaves first. I decided that I would have any of the leaves that overlap, that the smallest ones would be behind. So I'm just adding those first and kind of varying which color I put where so that I get a nice little variety there. And I'm just picking those up with a jewel picker. I got this one from Amazon and I really, really love it. So I'll have that link down below in case you're looking for a new one. This is definitely the best one that I've ever used. And it comes in a 4-pack with extra nibs as well, so it really is a great value for your money. And you could just have extras or give away the extras to your friends or whatever you want to do. So now that I have all of my small leaves attached, I'm going to start working on my larger leaves. And again, I'm just going to repeat that process. For some of the leaves that have to be tucked behind, I did just use my fingers because I had to really get down in there. but for the rest I did use the jewel picker. That one I accidentally put on upside down and then the glue was on the front, so I just swapped it out for another one. Thankfully I die cut extra just in case I needed more. So I'm going to continue just filling in those leaves, and I'm trying to put the shadow down toward the bottom of the card so that it looks like the light is coming in from above. So I am just working my way around there, again making sure to vary the colors of the leaves so that we get some nice bits of contrast on there. And I really love how those really vibrant greens just make the scene look so much more colorful and full. But I actually decided that I wanted the card to have even more color. So once I covered up all of the leaves that were supposed to be attached, I actually popped up a few more with some foam tape so that they would be on the same level as the ones on the branches. And I'm going to continue adding them here and there. Just to make the scene look even more full and interesting and give it even more color. And for some of these leaves, I'm tucking the end right up under that frame so that it looks like the leaves are coming from further back on those branches, and then just adjusting as needed if I want to add a second leaf in that little cluster. Then I'm going to bring in my flowers, and since I only have 6 of these, I want to be a little bit more careful with my placement. So I'm just going to add 1 dot of liquid glue at a time, and then add my flower, and then kind of assess and see where I want to put the next one, just to make sure that I have them kind of spaced a bit evenly throughout, and also so they're not like lined right up, straight up and down from each other. I just want to make sure that I have it kind of spread out and filling up the scene as much as possible. So I added another one onto the branch and kind of tucked it behind the beehive a little bit. And then I was left with one and no real place to put it. So again, I just decided to pop it up on some foam tape and add it next to those leaves at the top. Kind of looks like the branch is extending behind it that way. And then I can dot the centers in and just pick up the little round pieces and add those with my jewel picker. And there is a super fine tip under the other end cap, but I just, for whatever reason, I usually prefer using my fingers. I added another couple leaves so that it didn't look like that flower was on the very end of the branch. And now I'm ready to start building out my bees. So first I'm just going to pop out all of the inner pieces of the die cut on the yellow main part of the bee. And then I'll start adding some liquid glue to the back of the yellow part. I started adding it on the black, but then realized it made more sense to put it on the back of the yellow, because then I could see exactly where I needed to place it, where it wouldn't come through the holes. So I'm just going to line those up over the black part of the body, make sure that they are nice and straight on there, and then set them aside to dry. This glue dries super fast, so it only takes a second or two. And then once I have all of the bodies assembled, I will grab the wings. They are a bit more pearlized on one side, so I'm going to put that side up, and I'm going to add just a little bit of glue right to the center part that goes back behind the head, the neck part, and then I can place the bee right over top. Make sure that they are on there straight as well. Since this glue does dry really fast, I want to make sure to have those just how I want them before that sets up. And then once I have all 3 of my bees, I'm going to give them some rosy cheeks. And I'm going back to the shades that I used on my flowers. So I did R22 first, and then I'm going to blend that out with the R20. Just softening that into the yellow of their bodies. And then I also grabbed R11 to soften that even further. I'll leave that to dry back for a bit and move on to the rest of my sentiment. So I'm going to bring in my letters and line those up in the center between the happy and the day and figure out where I want those placed. Then I'll take my EK Success reverse tweezers and I'm going to start with the middle E. That way I can make sure that everything on the outer edge is lined up. I got a bit too much glue on there, so I just wiped the excess off with my finger and then lined that up in the center. And then I'll take my next E, and rather than line that up straight with the first E, I decided to make it just a little bit higher to add some more whimsy to the card, add a bit more movement. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the B. I'll add my liquid glue to the back of that, and then I'm going to place it just a little bit higher than that center E at the same level as the outer E. Then I'll grab my little bees and figure out where they are going to go. I knew I wanted one up toward the top left since there was a little bit of a hole there, and I just felt like I needed something placed there. And then I'm going to add the other two, one on the top right and then one on the lower left. And I'm going to add some foam tape behind that top left bee so that he can be hanging over the edge of that hive a little bit and still be on the same level as everything else. I'll take that extra little piece of foam tape that I tore off from the back of him and place it behind the other top right bee. And then this last little bee is going to get glued flat to the beehive, and he's going to overlap that center area just a little bit. I did also take the stitch rectangle frames and die cut a piece of ballet slippers cardstock so that I could have a nice pop of color around the outer edge. I'm going to add my liquid glue all around the original frame, and then I will add that pink one right over top, just making sure to line that up straight and then gently press that down. Of course, this card needs a little bit of glitter, so I'm going to put some Stardust stickles in the centers of each of the flowers, and then I also decided to add it to the word bee in my sentiment, and I coated the entire letter with that so that we would have a good amount of sparkle there. And I nearly forgot that I had not attached this panel to a card base yet. So I'm going to go back to the card base that I stamped on the inside of earlier, add some liquid glue to this focal panel, and then just glue it right over top. So the inner part of this card is going to match the outer frame. And that is going to finish this one up, so I'll lift that up so you can see it in a bit more detail and catch some of that sparkle and shine, and of course give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. The products I use will all be listed and linked in the description bar below in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thanks so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in the next. Bye-bye!